So if you haven't seen it yet, earlier this week I uploaded my first short. I didn't plan it or anything, but I just had my first dose of the vaccine and inspiration hit me. So I'll probably be doing more of those in the future. Just don't expect it to be a regular thing or anything. It may end up like that, but for now I'm just gonna do one if and when I have the inspiration. So stay tuned. Hello there, I'm Simon, welcome to my channel. Today's topic is the bard. Well, a bard anyway. But everyone just calls him the bard for some reason. But that's not what this video is about. But I am talking about William Shakespeare. Well, kinda. I'm not talking about Bill himself. I'm talking about a bunch of his plays. See, according to classical drama theory, there's three unities that the playwright needs to keep in mind, which is the unity of time, the unity of place, and the unity of action. Basically, that means that there's only one time period, one location, and one line of action in the play. They do this to keep everything simple enough and basically contained to the capabilities of a theater. I mean, we're talking Globe Theatre, not Hollywood. The point is that for about a third of Bill's plays, the unity of location is somewhere in Italy, which is interesting because all of the others are either English history or antiquity. So clearly Italy is a big deal for Bill. But why? Now you may think that he probably just went there on a trip and fell in love with the country, right? That's how inspiration works. It just hits you when you're very out of your regular life. So we really don't need to make this any harder than it needs to be. Italy's an inspiring country, especially to a British guy. So I guess the real question is, has he ever been there? Has Bill Shaky at one point or another traveled to Italy? Well, we don't really know. Here's the thing, there's a short period of his life, around 1590 of the Christian era, when we don't actually know where he was hanging out. And when he returns to the surface, he does it as an established playwright with a bunch of plays about Italy. So obviously a lot of people have theorized that he used this time to travel around and see Italy. So it's definitely possible that Bill went to Italy and that all of this is just inspiration for an artistic tourist. Totally possible. But is it likely? Well, there was actually a tradition back in the day where the kids of the aristocracy would do a tour around Europe. It was called the Grand Tour, and it was considered a kind of coming of age ritual. The tour was supposed to provide them with experiences and contacts that would serve them well in their adult lives. Of course, in reality, it was just an excuse to do a lot of drinking and stuff that is not safe for work. Anyway, the thing is that this was more of an 18th century thing, which is a little late for Billy, considering he died in 1616. Besides, Bill was the son of a glove maker. Now, don't get me wrong, that's a respectable and impressive job, and he was successful, but it hardly makes him an aristocrat. So it just doesn't seem very likely to me that Bill would have done one of those. Now, there is another explanation for Billy's love for Italy. Professor Martino Juvara argued that William Shakespeare was actually a guy called Michelangelo Florio Cololanza. Reason being that colare can be translated to shake, and a lanza is a spear. So the guy's literally called Shakespeare, except in Italian. Now that's not a terrible argument in itself. I mean, changing one's name was not uncommon in those days. But usually people would change their names from whatever their name was to Latin, because that was fancy. But if an Italian went to England, their Italian name would already be fancy, and I honestly see no reason why they would change that to the not fancy English version. Also, Michelangelo doesn't usually translate to William. And that's the main argument for this theory. So, needless to say, I don't find it very credible. This is a kind of theory like Da Vinci was Chinese, which, believe it or not, is a legit theory. I mean, it's very intriguing and fascinating, and it makes for a great story, but it's mostly based on it could happen in one very specific, though unlikely, scenario. So let's move on. So if he probably never went to Italy, and he most likely wasn't Italian himself, why did he write about Italy that much? Well, the short answer is that everyone was doing it. London was a metropolis. It was, and still is really, a hub where a bunch of different nationalities would meet for trade. And one of the most prominent of those nationalities was Italian. So, of course, people are going to be fascinated by it. Like all English people, Shakespeare saw Italy as a cradle of learning and art, which does make sense. Italy was quite literally the cradle of universities, and to a lesser extent, but still super significant, of the Renaissance itself. So, is it any wonder that Bill and his contemporaries were intrigued? Not to mention that a bunch of the stories Bill was basing his stories on were set in Italy. Oh, didn't I mention that? Yeah, Bill didn't come up with all of this on his own. He used sources. And for the plays based on antiquity and English history, it's pretty obvious where he got his inspiration. But what about the other ones? Well, in 1509, someone called Ludovico Ariosto wrote a comedy called I Suppositi, which means something like the exchange. So it refers to the subjects of a deal between two people. Anyway, that comedy would become the basis for The Taming of the Shrew. The story of Romeo and Juliet came from the Storia di due nobili amanti by Luigi da Porto. Of course, it can be traced back further to the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, which can be found in Ovidius's Metamorphoses. Interestingly enough, said story also features in The Midsummer Night's Dream, so Billy definitely knew it. The point is that, in a more literal sense, the story of Romeo and Juliet as such, in Verona, with those characters and everything, was already a thing in da Porto's work. Someone called Giovanni Battista Giraldi wrote a collection of stories called Gli Ecatomiti, which can be translated to the 100 stories. And that collection provided the inspiration for a couple of Shakespeare's plays, including Othello. And let's not forget The Two Gentlemen of Verona, which is based on the Commedia dell'arte. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that Bill Shakespeare did not in fact make up these stories from scratch, but instead was covering and modeling, aka imitatio et aemulatio, prominent Italian literary works. So it would seem that in a lot of cases he set his stories in Italy simply because the thing he was covering was already set in Italy. He was just being accurate to the source material. But how come he gets everything so right? I mean, one of the big arguments people make for Shakespeare having visited Italy himself is that he portrays it very accurately. So if he was only basing it on hearsay and such, how come he got everything so right? Well, first of all, did he? Well, he did get a bunch of details spot on, but in many other cases, he shows little to no local significance. For example, The Two Gentlemen of Verona and The Taming of the Shrew are labeled as being set in Italian cities, and the names and descriptions and such do hammer home that this is in Italy. But it doesn't go beyond the surface level. Like, all you really need to do is change the names, and it might as well be set in England. So it seems to me that Bill just took what he knew and draped it with an Italian veil to make it more interesting. And don't get me wrong, that's not a bad thing. That's kind of exactly what Pixar does a lot as well. But then in other cases, it is very significant that this is Italy. The masked balls in Romeo and Juliet, and Much Ado About Nothing, for example, are very Italian in nature. On multiple occasions, Bill also mentions the Rialto, gondolas, and the maritime nature of Venice, which is very typical. So he did know what he was talking about, even if he never went there. How? Well, by talking to people. As I said, there were a lot of Italians in London at the time, so I think he probably just went to them. There was an inn, not that far from the theatre area, called the Olifant, or Elephant, and it was a favorite for the Italian visitors, so it seems more than likely that Bill would have had a bunch of Italian drinking buddies. Not to mention that he wasn't the only one writing about Italy. Many others did, and a lot of them were aristocrats and people who had the opportunity to travel around and write poems and such about what they saw. So Billy Boy probably just wrote about Italy because everyone else was doing it, and because the stories he was covering were already set in Italy. Case closed, really. I mean, there's plenty of interesting stuff to discover about this, so by all means dig deeper. But for me, this will do. Time for the YouTube thing. You know the drill, peeps. Everything you can do is summed up neatly. And if you don't know what to comment, why don't you tell us what your favorite Shakespeare play is, and why? I think mine is probably A Midsummer Night's Dream, because fairies being fairies. What about you? Let me know down below. And farewell, friends. Thus the video ends. Adieu, adieu, adieu. Thanks for watching.